Hello guys, how yous all doing tonight? I hope everybody on the east coast of the USA are snuggled up nice and cozy. Looks like it's going to be some storm over there. Could be evacuations. Anyway guys, I was going to go a different direction tonight. I've been meaning to read this book. I've been watching it as a series, but the guy that reads it, he's got the pages on the screen. And I end up reading past them because the guy reads so slow and meticulous, and he's really good at pronouncing the words and everything, but it kind of stumps the flow for me, so I thought I'd read it myself. And I know a lot of people will be into this book. A lot of people will hate it. The Christians will hate this book because it kind of defies the Bible. But don't be fooled by the title, Britain, the Key to World History. This book here, guys, this has got a taste of Atlantis in it, sunken islands, the Celts. There's lots of shit in this. It's really interesting, and I think it's been overlooked. This book was published in 1946, so it's an old book. 1946, guys. It's an old book, and it was one of my subs that made me aware of it, because I've been looking at alternate history, and like there's a theory that the Celtic culture started in Austria-Hungary and moved eastwards towards Britain. But I think the Celtic culture started in Britain and moved the opposite way. And I think the same goes for the Bible, guys. Honestly, I think the same goes for the Bible. There's so many clues in the Bible that point more to Western Europe than the Middle East. Like, for example, they call Palestine the land of honey and milk. The place is a desert, guys. The place is a desert. It's not really the land of honey and milk. And there's a few... And I listened to the first 4 parts of this guy reading the book, and there was a few things I thought, that sounds a bit iffy. There was a place called Doggerland. I thought, Doggerland? Where the hell's that? Typed it up, and lo and behold, Wikipedia... there was a land that connected Scotland, Norway, Shetland, Iceland, but it's sunk under the sea now. So there's a lot of truth to this book. There's a lot of good research. This is a lifetime's worth of research, I think, for this guy. So this book, don't be fooled by the shady title, Britain, the Key to World History. This book's pretty interesting. It's got some fascinating things that will annoy a lot of people, but it'll get a lot of people thinking. People like Pete Shea and Martin Leakey will love this. This will send them down so many rabbit holes. It's unbelievable. But like I said, I'm just reading this. This is no my view, but it's really interesting. It's going to get a lot of people thinking. Anyway, I think I'll just read the first part tonight, and I'll see if how you think about it. But I'm going to read it anyway. I'm going to read a whole lot. I've downloaded PDF. But I just think it's worth sharing with people, because I don't think a lot of people are aware of this book, because it's old, 1946. And the guy that wrote it, he wasn't necessarily religious either. He wasn't religious. He was a journalist for I think it was the Daily Mail. So he's looking at it from a sort of more historical sort of point of view. And there is lots of flaws in the Bible, guys. Come on, you can't deny that. There's lots of shit in the Bible that doesn't make sense. And you just wonder, just like Assassin's Creed. When you play Assassin's Creed, you've got characters, you've got Jerusalem, you wonder if the people that made Assassin's Creed, they've obviously never been to Jerusalem, but they can create the whole place, they can build temples, they can create characters. And sometimes I think the Bible was written in Western Europe and imported into the Middle East. There's lots of things that don't add up, especially in the Bible when it says to go certain places and they aren't there. So anyway, guys, I'll proceed with the book. But like I said, some of you will like it, you can stay, listen. Some of you will hate it because you'll have your own view. But at the end of the day, this is just an objective look at this book. And I hope you enjoy it, guys. So I'll just start it off. And excuse any... I might savage some words because there's lots of old Greek words, Latin words, there's Celtic words, there's lots of strange words. But I'll try my best, guys, and I'll see what you think. I'll give you all a shout in chat first. Right. Who is it? Right, we've got DQ, we've got Shroomy, YouTube, Cynthia, Charlotte, Super Noodles. It's becoming my biggest sub right now. I'm not going to call them fans. My biggest favourite sub, I'll call them. This when channels say fans, man, it just makes me cringe. I'm like, oh god, fans. Right, YouTube is a super. Right, okay. Noodles, right, okay. Nice to see you guys. And like I said, if there's other more interesting streams, go ahead. But this is more for me as well, because I find myself when I read books, I skim through them, and if I know there's people watching, I might put more effort into trying to get the words to sink in and the information to actually sink in. So, anyway, how's the stream? No bad. Right, anyway, here's the title. Britain, the Key to World History by Comyns Beaumont. Ryder and Company, 47 Princess Gate, London, SW7, New York, Melbourne, Sydney, Cape Town. And it starts off here in quote, "And on earth shall be monsters, a generation of dragons of men, and likewise of serpents." Clement Apocalyptic Fragment. Ooh. But like I said, guys, I've been looking into Skara Brae, Orkney in Scotland, and there's up in Skara Brae, there's villages, the oldest villages in Europe. They were buried, and I'm sure there was some cataclysmic event, and this guy in this book kind of puts it into the Noah flood, ties it in with all that. It's really interesting, guys. It really is. It gets you thinking. I'm not saying all of it's true and factual, but it really does get you thinking. Anyway, here's the content. It's just the contents alone get you thinking. Pete Shea will be rubbing his hands, I'm telling you guys. Right, the contents. The foreword, part 1. Crete, motherland of men and gods. 1. The Shetland Isles and prehistoric Crete. The collapse of the Cretan Empire. And part 2, the Garden of Eden. It's got Avebury, city of Hercules. Number 2, expulsion of Israel from Mizraim. Number 3, the vicissitudes of Bath, city of Ammon. 4, Gades or Sodom and Avonmouth. 5, the romance of Glastonbury. 6, Avalon, Garden of Eden. Part 3, the climax. Ooh. And number 1, the manoeuvres of Moses. The Isle of Isaiah. Number 3, the wonder in the land. Number 4, the first Messiah. Number 5, the aftermath. And appendices is the Bible chronology, the Trojan dynasty of Britain, Jerusalem, and Edinburgh. This is what Pete Shea loves, guys. Pete Shea's got some theory about this as well, for some reason. And when I seen this, I was like, God, I've heard this before. Pete Shea. And he's not aware of this book either, because I mentioned it to him. So there's illustrations in the book. Got a labyrinth of lofty caverns in the Isle of Noss in Shetland, the age-old stones of Avebury, the Adam rocks at Avebury, a medieval map of Bath, city of the waters, claimed as original Philistine Gath, later named No or Rabbath Ammon. A 17th century view of the island of Avalon or Glastonbury looking from Wirral Hill towards the Tor. Celtic chessboard fields at Windmill Hill, Wilts, is laid out on hilltops in the early Iron Age by some ruling authority. Celtic chessboard fields near St Anne's Farm in the highest part of Wiltshire. The people were removed from the valleys to new hilltop villages before the flood of Atlantis or Noah. Black magic, a Kabiri initiation found on a sculptured stone at Palenque, Mexico. A unique representation of prehistoric knowledge of firearms. Ooh. Sacred trees showing fluorescent symbols of fire weapons. Edinburgh Castle seen from Princes Street Gardens. You've probably seen Edinburgh Castle with me, guys. A view of Arthur's Seat, Edinburgh, claimed as original Mount of Olives. Now that'll get Pete Shea salivating, I'm telling you. Right, the foreword. This volume is a companion work to the riddle of prehistoric Britain, in which I endeavoured to prove by evidence gathered over a wide field from ancient and modern sources that the British Isles were highly civilised from the earliest times, and indeed that Britain may be proudly enthroned as the true and original mother of civilisation. I claimed on evidence produced that the supposedly lost island or drowned island continent, given the name of Atlantis by Plato, was not a mere romance or myth without substance, as is generally believed, but on the contrary, it was a serious epitome of the most stupendous natural catastrophe which has ever afflicted the human race, both because of the magnitude and the severity of the visitation. I sought, moreover, to prove that the Atlantean calamity was a variation, in other words, of the flood of Noah, or, as the Greeks termed it, the deluge of Deucalion. For this purpose, evidence was derived from geographical, geological, astronomical, historical, and legendary sources to effect that this major catastrophe afflicted northern and western Europe, mainly the Scandinavian lands and beyond all the British islands. I claimed, in fact, that the Atlantis island was no other than the British Isles, which bears the scars of that catastrophe to this day, that Atlantis was not permanently submerged or even much of it, tremendous though the ultimate effects were. These islands I showed were the true Hesperides, or happy islands of yore, and are known to have been inhabited from the earliest Paleolithic or Old Stone Age onwards, and were the original domicile of the sons of Adam, who were the titans or giants of classic fame, as well as being the Atlanteans of Plato. There's some massive claims there already. My object, may I point out, was far greater than any mere academic effort, as some critics seem to imagine, to identify Atlantis. The disaster to Atlantis was only indirectly my theme, for what matters is what lay and still lies behind these facts, as facts I claim there are on the evidence. For it were the flood of the scriptures, it thereby brings into the orbit of the northern Europe the nations related to the event directly or indirectly, such as the Chaldeans, Egyptians, Israelites, Hellenes or Greeks, and many others. It cannot be isolated as such, for it challenges the long accepted beliefs and dogma that the flood occurred in the Middle East, the supposedly original Chaldea, as to which, incidentally, in spite of most careful investigations, even within recent years, there exists not a tittle of solid geological or other evidence to support such a calamity in those regions. So what he's saying here, guys, is there's big stories of floods, Noah's floods in the Middle East, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that it happened. And I think he goes on to show quite a lot of evidence of these things happen in Northern Europe at the same time. Inferentially, also, if correct, it must undermine the long accepted claims in the relation to the lands we term Assyria, Egypt and Palestine, and I fear necessarily disputes the accuracy of many modernists' interpretations from inscribed stones or papyri. In other words, we have been misled in these matters. My sole aim is to get the truth regarding the past, as it bears in many striking ways upon the present. But let me say, if the further claims I advance in the work are sustained, it must logically signify that the segregation of Bible history as a thing apart from the equivalent classic peoples has piled up completely false conceptions and valuations regarding the history of nations in past times. For example, I produce evidence to show that the Euronids of Crete, which Crete was accepted by the Greeks at least as the motherland of the original race of mankind, were the equivalent of the people called of the Chaldees in the book of Genesis, and that they dwelt not in the Orient or Mediterranean, but in the British Isles. If I prove correct in determining that such roads lead originally to that very ancient group of islands, the Shetlands, Orkneys, which straddle both Scandinavia and Britain, and that these were largely shattered by a violent natural catastrophe, we begin to perceive that the Gnostic and Curetes of Crete, close kindreds of the Chaldeans, were the sons of Seth, or Sheth, the son of Adam, from who apparently Shetland or Sethland acquired its name in the regions of Caledonia. Again, only a variation of Chaldea, whose sons are probably the most ancient existing race of civilized man. So Shetland are islands in the north of Scotland. They're just a wee bit higher than Orkney. Orkney are the first set of islands, I think, and then you've got the Shetland Isles. The account of the last days of Atlantis is particularly valuable in research, where we are told by Plato of a great war between the Atlanteans and their blood relations who crossed the sea to reach them. A war lasting 13 years, and in the 14th year, when the Atlanteans were at the point of exhaustion, the city of Athens held out and defeated the enemy, but that all her warriors, like those who opposed her, were drowned, leaving aside the statement that the original Athens held out and alone defeated the invaders. It was, according to Plato, an Atlantean city situated on that island, and thus we must assume the mother city of later Athens in the Mediterranean Greece, like other early Hellenic sites. Can we, however, synchronize Plato with the Bible references to the flood? The actual events of these dramatic 13 years culminating in the Great Catastrophe is the main theme of this book. So it's interesting stuff, guys. He's trying to match Plato's statements with Bible statements and try to look for evidence if there was a catastrophe. The true arena of this veiled yet historic event, as I endeavour to show, was a clash between nations known in the scriptures, including Gog and Magog, in which the invasion and slavery of other Bible peoples in the British Isles was the aim of the invaders. It culminated in extraordinary events, both in the celestial spaces and on this unhappy earth. The final celestial disaster itself, as I described fully in my previous work, was on such an immense and concentrated scale, and at the same time so irregular in its distribution, that certain parts were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable for a long period, while yet others escaped with only comparative sufferance. And this is what I've looked into, guys. I've looked into Lost Islands of Scotland and why Skara Brae was completely covered over. It looked like a massive natural disaster totally covered this village, because it's known as like the Pompeii Europe, because it was preserved perfectly with the sand. And I thought it was maybe volcanic stuff from up Iceland, because it's really volcanic up that way. But this author, Comyns Beaumont, I think he goes on to claim that there was an asteroid that hit the Earth at this time. A giant asteroid. Right. Where was I? Among its permanent effects were a variation in the Earth's axis, a lengthening of the solar year, and a consequent change in climate, whereby many nations in the north were forced to emigrate to obtain the means of subsistence. So this is what I thought as well. I was thinking that maybe there was another ice age caused by this volcano. Maybe there was smoke that blocked out the sun, so the people that originally lived in Britain moved through the Mediterranean. And this is maybe how Celtic culture spread through Europe. Not the other way around, from Hungary and Austria to Britain. I think it spread from Britain through to Hungary, because Britain is the most rich in Celtic culture compared to anywhere in Europe. So I think it's been spread that way because of certain events. And I thought maybe volcanoes, smoke in the sky. It still happens today in Iceland. But this is an interesting theory. The myth of Phaeton describes how the ill-fated son of Helios, having stolen his father's steeds, tried to drive the chariot of the sun, but they bolted, whereby they threatened the earth's extinction. And Zeus, seeing the whole world was thus in imminent danger of destruction, hurled Phaeton into the river Eridanus in the country of the Comyns. The explanation of the myth, as Plato himself records it, was the declination of celestial bodies. Actually, it would seem a twin or tandem comet, which struck the earth in the Comyrian lands. This disastrous event is recorded on certain prehistoric Scottish zodiacs, as I showed in my previous work, in which the chariot of Phaeton is represented symbolically as wheels with a connecting axle, described by Scottish archaeologists as spectacles. They, being naturally innocent of the intention of these stones, probably erected by the sons of Seth, or say Chaldeans in the Caledonian Islands. Interesting. The Comyrians, in whose country the disaster happened and where flowed the river Eridanus, converts the mythological into reality. They agree with the Cymry of Britain. And see, the Cymry of Britain, that's the Welsh. This Cymry. They reckon that maybe they're related to the Cimmerians somehow, tribe. The Cimbri of Scandinavian lands, the people known to classic poets as the Hyperboreans, dwellers beyond the north wind, the Galatiae of Pausanias, the Gauls or Gaels or Celts, always the tall, fair-haired and blue-eyed men of the north. So Phaeton must compel us to understand the myth by making us look to the north of Europe, where he was thrown to the earth. In a true revision of the prehistoric past, the Mediterranean becomes only a very secondary settlement of the ruling races of mankind from the beginning. Britain's remote ancestors through many centuries erected an advanced civilization, built walled cities with towns, villages and ports, and sailed ocean-going ships, being a maritime people of great fame. They erected also chains of powerful fortresses, some of which have survived the vicissitudes caused by man and the elements for well over 3,000 years, laid long, straight roads and constructed canals which transported goods from one end of Britain to the other. Her sons faced hazardous voyages long before deep-sea soundings were undertaken to the most distant parts of the earth, and established trading centres and commerce, while their main search was ever for gold. They manufactured jewels, employing gold, silver and bronze, besides precious stones. At an early date they mastered the science of how to manufacture bronze, designed weapons of warfare and discovered the secret art of how to make and use firearms, otherwise black magic. Solomon built up his wealth and made the Israelites in his age the dominating people by his knowledge of magic, an art described by Josephus in these words: God also enabled him to learn the skill which expels demons, which is a skill useful and sanative to man. Incidentally, Solomon was a grand master of prehistoric Freemasonry, a very ancient fraternity earlier known as the Kabiri gods. Its origin often attributed to him, and some of the mystic ceremonies used in the Masonic cult are probably derived from his epoch. Yet, how many present-day Masons can understand the inner meaning of the two hollow pillars, Jachin and Boaz, which they are so fond of symbolising? And I'm sure these pillars were the only things left after Noah's flood. I think they were, God's word were scribed on two pillars. I think it was a stone pillar and a wooden one. I think these are Jachin and Boaz, and I think one of them survived. I'm not sure if the wooden one or the stone. I think it was the stone one. But I think that's the whole tie to Freemasonry. That's why you see the pillars in Freemasonic symbolism. In the Great Migration, introduced largely by pre-knowledge of what was about to happen, owing to celestial phenomena, judging from certain passages of Jeremiah, the Israelites in their exodus were led through dark Arctic wastes, where no man dwelt, the Siberian lands. Many immigrants found their way to the shores of the Mediterranean, and others went to the rivers Volga, Vistula, Dnieper, Dniester and the Crimea, onwards to Asia Minor and thence to the Middle East, where we find in Iraq what appears to be prehistoric Gothic inscriptions and occult designs as to which much might be said. In a total different direction across the North Atlantic, others made hazardous voyages and endured terrible privations in search of the sun and settled finally in America, mostly in Mexico, ages before Columbus discovered that continent. Ho ho ho! This guy's holding no bars. He's trying to bust every paradigm here. And I love this stuff. I love it. I'm not saying it's true, but it's a good way to think outside the box. And he's got stuff to back it as well. Like I said, a lot of this stuff you can research yourself, and he's hit the nail on the head with quite a lot of stuff here. The land, many again went southwest into France, Spain and Portugal, hugging the Atlantic or migrating into North Africa. The land we now call Egypt was colonised then, or not much earlier, as shown by astronomical evidence, and was originally peopled by fair Celts from the shores of Britain. Jesus, man. That's a claim. This was the exodus of the Aryans, some of whom returned later to their primeval homes, and about a century after, perhaps in some cases in less time, when earlier fears had been dissipated, for humanity rarely learns from the past, and the fertile British lands invited newcomers. These islands were again occupied by nations crossing the narrow seas, including especially those whom Geoffrey of Monmouth names the Trojans, and our modern anthropologists, the Goidels. Panic and a change of climate in the northern lands were the main inspiration which sent these people on their long and sad trek in search of the new domiciles. The edifices and the religion of Egypt speak eloquently of the instinct of terror as their guiding motive, and also showed in my previous work. The famous Egyptian Book of the Dead, influenced completely by the epic of the flood and composed in the name of Thoth, Hermes, and its ritual caused the souls of the dead to undergo a fanciful, final, gloomy pilgrimage to the sacred West. Indeed, I contend, to the very scene of the former shambles in western Scotland, to the legendary Amenta, identified as the tiny island of Staffa, near Iona in the Hebrides, where the wandering spirits were supposed to be judged by Osiris, and were rewarded or consumed according to their lives on earth. Staffa lay in the very vortex of the greatest area of destruction at the time of the flood, water being but one element concerned, and later became the underworld of the Celts as it was of the Hellenes. The flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation mankind has ever experienced, and as they may experience again, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be traced to some considerable extent by effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was sudden and terribly swift and violent. So they're talking about a big change in climate and a big movement of people. And it doesn't sound too far-fetched to me, to be honest, guys. Especially when you've got traces of prehistoric people in Britain. So people did live here. As far back as that. My present volume, as I mentioned, traces the course of the 13 Years' War to its origin in sources and elucidates the main arena of the dramatic conflict which stares us in the face in the scriptures if we know where to seek for it. To be enabled to accomplish this was necessitated the identification of the most important regions overrun by the invaders from the furthermost north and from the direction of the Baltic and Low Countries. Much attention has been directed to the lands of the West, mainly Somerset and Wiltshire, so important for various reasons, where I have claimed to identify sites known to readers of the scriptures, some of which survive and flourish to this day. The complete annihilation of cities by man is not easy as it may seem. Jerusalem was said to be destroyed stone by Hadrian, and yet it still exists as a most important capital. In the arrangement, I found it advisable to devote the opening part of the consideration of Crete, the original crate of Homer, because its former great importance in the world of prehistory. The third section describes in detail the scene and action of the 13 Years' War, and especially the part enacted in it by Jerusalem. When this is understood, it will be apparent how advanced, wealthy, and highly civilized Britain was up to the Roman occupation, and thereby to reflect how sad it is that Roman ignorance, tyranny, and censorship have for long centuries presented an utterly false impression of the courage, genius, and enterprise of the various state of the island they so coveted, robbed, and left in a condition of chaos. One further important point needs to be emphasized. The history of the civilized world in the past had little or nothing in common with Asia and Africa, and to get to the truth, we must raise the latitude of Europe to the lands mainly prominent, and even largely forget the Mediterranean Sea. The Aryan or white race with fair or red hair and blue eyes never had any racial connection with the Oriental peoples. The brown-skinned, dark-eyed and dark-haired races, the law of latitude forbids it, just as the northern Aryans who invaded India and settled there as rulers and princes, despite the rigid law of caste they formulated, in the course of a few generations became absorbed in the native population, as also happened in Mexico. Indeed, the world's civilizations owes less than nothing to the Asiatic peoples, even though the Persians, who tyrannized for centuries over the West through treachery and the use of magic, can really be traced to Russia and the Russians. Their characteristics throughout the centuries scarcely, if at all, changed other than in name, and who, in their decadence, were overthrown and driven back to their oriental bounds by Alexander the Great. Virile races do not die out without a trace. We are told by the historian that the Thracians disappeared from their lands by the Hellespont, and yet Herodotus says that they were the most powerful people in Europe, who dissipated their strength by tribal quarrels. They did not disappear from the Balkan lands, for they were never there. Transfer Pontus, or the Euxine Sea, or the Hellespont, to where they really belonged geographically, named the Baltic and Skagerrak, and you will find the Thracians readily enough. They were the Scandinavians, and were apparently settled from primeval times also in northern Scotland, close kindred of the Caledonians, who, like them, held wives in common, tattooed themselves, buried wives alive with their husbands, adored single combat, claimed descent from Hermes, worshipped Dionysus as their principal deity, raised mounds over the graves of their great chiefs, and held funeral games, all of which were also the characteristics of Odin's followers. It suffices to add that the country beyond their northern frontiers was uninhabitable by reason of the icy cold, for it lay under the North Pole. Take again the Trojans of classic fame. They were a very brave and fine nation, advanced in civilization, who offered sacrifices to the dead of bowls of warm milk, goblets of wine, and also raised funeral mounds. Where do you find such mounds or barrows? All over Scandinavian lands, also, and in Denmark as in Britain, but never in the Near East. They shook hands with one another, and anyone who knows the East is aware that such was never an Oriental custom. How can we explain Virgil's statement of King Priam, slain and mutilated by Pyrrhus, as he sat on his sacred throne, that he had been proud monarch over so many countries and nations? But this we can say. The Trojans, after the great catastrophe, settled in great numbers in Britain, known as the Brigantes, whose history I trace, showing incidentally that Rome was founded by men of this very nation, and that they became the ruling people in Britain, south of the Clyde and Forth. They never originated in Asia Minor, but as will be seen from Ascania, Denmark, and the Low Countries, from the regions later known as Frisia, which is Holland. The Macedonians, well, Thracians, Cretians, Caledonians, and Macedonians were all of one kindred, and they could be tracked down to their habitat in Scotland and Scandinavia, having many areas in England as well. Illyria. Why does Jerusalem appear to have been regarded as in Illyria? It was not originally by the Adriatic Sea in the Mediterranean area. transfer the Greek or Latin name to its British rendering, Siluria, and we begin to recognise how the history of the Hebrews, the Iberes of Britain, were so largely played out in this island. How few appreciate the true history of the risings of the Silures against the Romans, and who fought with such fatal gallantry in a succession of wars opposing them, especially in the region south of the Forth. Yet thus shall we be getting nearer to the truth. It will be apparent in short that Armageddon was the same event as the great catastrophe, and that Jerusalem lay and still stands a great and noble city in Britain. If this sounds a stupendous claim to make, it nevertheless fits in with the rest. How many persons are aware that in AD 134, after Hadrian had defeated the Jews under Bar Kokheba, their proclaimed Messiah, and had captured the stronghold of Bathars, he caused Jerusalem to be utterly destroyed and the land devastated, with the result that it was full of graves, the market with slaves, and towns given over to wolves and wild beasts? How many more realise that the site of Jerusalem was completely forgotten for over 200 years, until Constantine the Great caused it to be discovered for political motives in the present Palestine? That's interesting, guys, for all you people that think the history has been reinvented and invented. Well, 200 years, Constantine suddenly discovered it, and he was the first one to go to Christianity. So they maybe even created this land, like stole it, a culture vulture, from the Celts, and established it in the Middle East. God knows, I've not read the whole book, but really interesting stuff, guys. As I show in the following pages of Palestine, Palestine of today fails to correspond in any way to the Old Testament, or come to that of the new writer Mr. H.D. Daunt several years ago in a work entitled The Centre of Ancient Civilization, denied that Palestine was the biblical Holy Land for definite reasons. He claimed that A, the assumption is based on Hebrew documents alone, B, the account of the Israelites being made slaves and fleeing from the Egyptian Pharaoh is not born out of any other evidence but the contrary. C, an exodus in the region of Sinai for 40 years with 600,000 warriors is an impossible story. D, Palestine, despite the accounts of its fertility and wealth, is perhaps the poorest land in West Asia apart from the deserts. Such a civilization, with its many cities, must have left its traces in the records of the neighbouring countries, but Palestine yields only the evidence derived from the names that have been scattered industriously about the land in various later centuries. F, there is frequent mention by scribes, archives, etc., so the art of writing must have been well known, and, moreover, princes and scribes seem to have possessed strong literary proclivities, yet, notwithstanding all this, not a single inscription has been found in Palestine which can be identified with the Hebrew kingdom. G, Jerusalem has failed to produce any trace of David and Solomon, any tablet or inscription or even foundation memorial. It might be added that the city entirely fails to conform topographically with its full descriptions given by Josephus and Nehemiah. The name of Europe was originally limited to a part of Western England, and continental Europe was Asia. To study a map of Europe so late, at the height of the Roman Empire, as prepared from the conventional acceptation of ancient geography, is a pathetic vision of emptiness. Except for southern Italy, Greece and Asia Minor, it contains Celtica, a vast and vague region stretching from the Atlantic to Venetia, and above it, east of the Rhine, Germania stretches far to the east with a few vague names. Dacia, Moesia and Thrace occupy the Balkan lands, and the Ister is interpreted as the Danube, whereas it should be the Rhine. Similarly, in the Hals River is placed in Asia Minor, but was the later Alvis or Albis, now the Elbe. These are a few names chosen at haphazard. If I am right in these statements, the question will well be asked how it all came about. The answer lies probably in the fact that the historians of the past on whom we have to rely on were mostly Greeks, and more especially Herodotus. But these Greeks were themselves very circumscribed in their knowledge of the world. They were unacquainted with geography because foreign travel was not in their purview, and mostly they derived the knowledge from the Phoenicians, whose purpose by no means necessarily served by widening Greek knowledge. They wrote their history from records or traditions, but their geography was vague. I first realised such shortcomings when I attempted to trace the detailed march of Xerxes from Persia to Athens along accepted lines, but before long I realised that this history simply could not possibly fit in with modern conceptions and compelled me to follow out fresh investigation with surprising results. So what this guy's saying is he tried to follow the historical accounts of the Battle of 300, because Xerxes from Persia, that's the guy you see in the movie, like sitting on the throne. So you see they make movies about 300, and this guy back in 1946, I think this was published, was saying that there's no trace of that ever happening. This is what made him look and investigate this. And it's fascinating stuff, guys. It's fascinating stuff. Like, don't let this title fool you. This is mind-blowing. A lot is mind-blowing. A lot it could be just a lot of shit, but I'll definitely look into this. As far as Bible geography is concerned, it appears that the main person responsible for its misinterpretation was Constantine the Great, who had definite motives for transferring the arena of Jewish history and that of Christ to another region altogether. He used Christianity as a valuable political asset, selected the East as his empire, and with the aid of Eusebius, Jerome, and others, invented the present Palestine. I cannot explore this very important and fascinating theme now, but hope to undertake it in the not very distant future in a life of that remarkable monarch who was born in York in the Bedern. If this be correct, the present-day Jews who make a historical claim to Palestine are utterly wide of the mark. Oh. Like I said, a lot of people won't agree with this, but this is not about making people happy. This is about research. And this guy's dedicated his whole life to this research, so come on, we give him the courtesy of reading it at least. My aim throughout, as I hope for the reader will appreciate, is to reconstruct the past history of the world, in which it appears that Britain, or more properly, the British Islands, played so prominent a part. But one cannot correctly report history unless the geography is also accurate, and so the position of countries and historic cities become of major importance. In my former book, as in this, I have seemingly taken great liberties with geography, and I have to confess that in a subject so confusing and big, it is difficult to always be accurate. It means much research. So even this guy is saying it's a big subject and detailed, and you need to research. Plato's famous Atlantis, as a matter of fact, knocks conventional geography and all the history or traditions attached to it sky high. Ignatius Donnelly, in his work Atlantis, said truly that the history of Atlantis is the key to Greek mythology. As indeed is the case, yet the mythology all points unhesitatingly to the earliest civilization as occurring in the Atlantic regions and not at all in the Mediterranean or in Asia Minor. Above all, the history of the Old Testament is the history of Atlantis. That these truths will be accepted is more than I would dare to believe. The world is misled today about the past, and the truth lies at the bottom of a very deep well. I can only presume to be a humble pioneer, but I hope that I may be able to hew a rough track, which others may widen into a great artery for the enlightenment of future generations. Very, very poignant foreword, I've got to say, guys. That was just the foreword. I've not even started the book. 1948. Comyns Beaumont. There's part 1. But I think I might end it here, guys. And maybe start part 1. I'll have a look at chat. I'll see how yous are. Let's see. Right. Who's in chat? Let me see. It's Captain Bullshit. How you doing, man? Shroomies in the house, as usual. Cigar Face is still here. Validation Boy, still here. Muscle Car Rock Lover. Nice to see you, man. Cat Earth is here. Sweaty, right, aye. Right, it just looks like the normal faces. Do you know what? I might read part 1. Since there's 28 people probably having a good laugh in my chat. I see that Validation Boy and Muscle Car Rock Lover are having a good slugfest in there. But like I said, guys, this book is going to kind of go against a lot of people's beliefs. It'll go against the Bible. It'll go against what people think are Jews. It'll go against the Greek history. It'll go against Roman history. There's a lot of things it contradicts in this book, and I think it's only healthy that we question it at least. Right. I might as well start part 1. You know what? I'm going to take a quick cigarette break. What's up, my love? Hope you're having a good night. Hope you're safe, VB. Not sure how close the storm is to you. Right, guys. I'll start off part one. I'll see how far I can get into this, and I'll continue the rest in another date. Part 1. Crete, motherland of men and gods. A land called Crete, in the mists of the wine-dark sea, a far land and rich, and thereon and men innumerable, and 90 cities. Odyssey. I couldn't tell you the 171 to 2. 1. The Shetland Islands and the prehistoric Crete. Those who have studied the account of the fate of the island of Atlantis, as recounted by Plato, may have been struck by the fact that whilst his heart, or centre of administration and commerce, is depicted as adjoining Mount Atlas, the word Atlas, Atlantic, and Atlantis possess no derivation from any known language of the old word, either ancient or modern. Yet, among the so-called native races of America, it is a living word. The Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg, a learned Americanist in his day, nearly a century ago, showed in his translation of the Codex Chimalpopoca of the Aztecs of Mexico that the word ATL signified water, and by extension the sea or ocean. This codex described the period of Nahuhi Atl, or forewater, when it states that all mankind was lost or drowned and found themselves turned into fishes. In a single day all was lost. It appears to relate definitely to the flood of Noah, for the text describes further how Nata and his spouse Nena built an ark, took refuge in it, and were saved to repeople the earth. It agrees also with the Timaeus of Plato, which says, in one day and one fatal night there came mighty earthquakes and inundations that engulfed that warlike people, the Atlanteans. The association of Mount Atlas with water accords with classic allusions to this famed and to many fabulous mountain, which was placed by Herodotus and others in the vicinity of Lake Triton, so named after the merman son of the god Poseidon. Plato himself described Atlas as a mountain not very high on any side, situated in the island of Atlantis. Herodotus, whose knowledge of the physical geography was mainly confined to the Mediterranean, says it was taper and round and of immense height, thus contradicting Plato and perhaps identifying it with the peak of Tenerife, 12,200 feet in the Canary Isles. Today, the name is vaguely given to the long mountain range which traverses Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, an inland mountain chain which in no possible manner conforms to the volcanic Mount Atlas, situated on an island and of no great height. There is reason for believing that the celestial blow, which so largely destroyed the island of Atlantis, also largely, if not entirely, devastated Mount Atlas, which according to Homer was as a consequence of the war made by the Titans on Zeus, another rendering of the war made by the Satans on God, compelled to bear heaven on his mighty head and hands, otherwise a mountain enveloped largely in a cloud or mist. Homer places Atlas in the columnar or pillar region. Atlas himself upbears the pillars high, which separate the earth from the heavens, he sings, and Hesiod situated him at the western extremity of the earth, near the Hesperides. And this is where I think they get the Hebrides in Scotland, the Hesperides. Holding the broad heaven on his head and unwearing hands, the pillar region in the western extremity of the earth, near the Hesperides, can only refer to one region, and that is the Western Highlands of Scotland and the Hebridean Islands off its coastline. See, Hebridean, Hesperides, seems similar to me. I've previously alluded to the fate of Mount Atlas as very much akin to that of Mount Prometheus, described in mythology as a brother of Atlas, which also suffered eclipse at the same tremendous period when the elements waged war upon a helpless world. If they were adjacent, and in view of the situation of Prometheus identified with reasonable certainty as Ben Mor, the once great volcanic mountain straddled the island of Mull, we should place Atlas, as the classic descriptions agree, amid Hesperides Isles among the pillars in the farthest west. Connected with this myth of the sufferings of Atlas is that of the fate of his daughters, the 7 Pleiades, who drowned themselves out of sorrow for their father's fate, or as an alternative myth represents it, because her sisters, the Hyades, also daughters of Atlas, were drowned on the same occasion, which we may reasonably interpret as a poetical method of indicating that they were submerged, perhaps some permanently, the others temporarily, as happened to the islands grouped around the island of Iona near Mull, and as shown by the effects of the considerable tidal waves which deposited detritus, indicating their past fate. So I think what he's saying here, that the sisters, these sisters of the 7 Pleiades who drowned themselves, I think these could be islands. These could represent islands, the 7 Pleiades. So they're putting daughters in place of islands. Interesting stuff. Only one of the Pleiades survived the catastrophe, we are told, namely Merope, the mortal, and perhaps it is straining possibilities too heavily to recall that the same tradition is latent of Iona, that 7 years before that awful day when a flood shall drown the entire region, including Ireland, the Happy Isle, shall raise her towers above the flood, yet it is a strange coincidence. The pillars or commoner formation attributed to the core of the former planet hurled on the occasion of the great catastrophe in the northern seas are found only in the basaltic-strewn islands of Scotland, namely the Hebrides and the Faroe Islands beyond. Although they also exist in Spitsbergen, while we find the old sandstone pillars such as the Old Man of Orkney, but the latter appear to have been deposited long before the basalt formation. To revert to the name of Merope given to one of the Pleiades, it should be recalled that the most ancient race of men, identified as generally Phoenicians or Chaldeans or Ethiopians, who were the bronze men and who dwelt according to tradition in their west near Mount Atlas, were also known as Meropes, with their city of Meru or Meru. Does that sound familiar, guys? Anyone that's into the flat earth has heard of Mount Meru. 2 minutes. So already, guys, we're starting to see words and names of places that are familiar, like Mount Meru, Hyperboreus, these places, and they keep popping up in this as well. Another myth of the deluge cycle tells of how Merops, king of Ethiopia, saved the remnant of humanity from perishing in the flood of the island of Kos, one of the Hellenic Sporades, and a name very near to the biblical Cush, the biblical equivalent to the Ethiopians who, for their part, according to Diodorus, claimed to be the first men in the world. Does this suggest that the city of Meru, or Mero, was identical with the capital of Atlantis? The implications from these traditions and myths all appear to radiate from the direction of the Western Hebrides. At all events, we must proclaim the importance of Britain in this search. We are delving amid the most ancient memories of the past in the Atlantic region, and one which the world of tomorrow should recognise for what it represents in the civilization of humanity from the earliest ages. In connection with all this, we cannot overlook at the same time the importance of the Shetland and Orkney Isles. If Crete were described by classic writers such as Pliny as a long and narrow island, as indeed is the Mediterranean islands so-called, so too is Shetland and also Orkney, which, if they originally formed one group, subsequently left in a tattered and torn condition by the action of celestial powers, were nearly 170 miles in length with a narrow breadth. Geologists have determined the existence of a former marine lake of considerable size and of shallow depth, of which they accord the name of Lake Orcady, stretching from off the coast of Caithness to Shetland mainland. This former lagoon might approximate to the Lake Triton, where Poseidon had his ocean palace and dwelt with his consort Amphitrite and his son Triton, although tradition perhaps points to the direction of Mull and Iona, where Poseidon certainly possessed such a marine temple at Aegae, on the island of Euboea, which I have shown in the fair certitude was the present island of Mull, a temple probably still to be identified with that enormous sea cavern known as McKinnon's Cave. Nevertheless, we find Thucydides refers strangely to Lake Triton when he says that the Spartans, in obedience to an oracle declaration of Delphi, colonised a small island in Lake Triton called Fla. Lying off Shetland, in the small island named Fola, almost exactly the same as Fla pronounced phonetically, it is situated 16 miles off Shetland's west coast and is famed for its perpendicular cliff scenery, the highest cliffs in the British Isles. If it answers to Fla, then we must search for the Lake Triton as answering perhaps to Lake Orcady. Geologists claim that in the late Tertiary Age or early Quaternary, land between Norway, Iceland and Scotland collapsed. This comparatively recent submergence, as Mr. Edward Clodd states in Primitive Man, was coincident with the opening up of the North Sea, formerly the estuary of the River Rhine, the widening of the mouth of the English Channel and the sinking of the lands between Devon and Brittany, in addition to the tremendous break-up of territories and islands in the Hebridean Sea. Deposits in Northern Ireland establish immense region of bogs, the piling up of mountains and the cutting out of enormous meteoric-formed fords in Norway, and last but not least, the devastation suffered by the Shetland and Orkney Islands. In such circumstances, it is not surprising that Plato speaks of the submersion of Atlantis. The Shetlands themselves are one of the oldest land surfaces in the world, composed almost entirely of metamorphic schistose rocks, porphyry and gneiss, with a certain amount of sandstone, while in the neighbourhood of St. Magnus Bay, in Fetlar and in Unst are large surfaces of granite and other igneous rocks. In fact, no similar region can excel Shetland in volcanic energy of the past. Sir John Murray and Mr. Johann Hjort, in their authoritative work The Depths of the Ocean, record a deep-sea soundings in the Atlantic, have recorded the existence of a submarine ridge which formerly linked together Iceland, the Faroe Islands and Shetland. Cutting through this Gulf Stream, following a channel from the western coast, connects the warm waters from the Atlantic and the northern Norwegian Sea. And this is that Doggerland. If anyone's heard of Doggerland, I'll pull it up, in fact. But the guy's telling the truth. There's a place that used to connect Britain to mainland France, and I think Norway was connected to Scotland. And after this catastrophe, the waters flooded, which created the English Channel and the North Sea. We'll have a wee look. This is Skara Brae, guys. Skara Brae up in Orkney. Skara Brae is a stone-built Neolithic settlement located on a bay of scale on the west coast of mainland, the largest island Orkney archipelago of Scotland. Consisting of 8 clustered houses, it was occupied from roughly 3180 BC to about 2500 BC. Europe's most complete Neolithic village, Skara Brae gained UNESCO World Heritage Site status as one of 4 sites making up the heart of Neolithic Orkney. Older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids, it has been called the Scottish Pompeii because of its excellent preservation. Anyway, we're not talking about that now, we're talking about Doggerland. And it sounds ridiculous, guys, but here we go here. Doggerland. British Atlantis. Telegraph. We'll have a look here. So this is Doggerland. This is what they believed was... Here's Shetland up here. But you can see where it was connected. Doggerland and Doggerbank. So they reckon here, Doggerland. So this part here was all land. It connected Ireland, Scotland, Norway, Shetlands, and this, I think this was maybe ice at the top here. You can see that the land used to be landed between France and Britain, mainland Britain. And there's another part, Doggerland, that was land as well. It looked like there was a little lake, or it looked like a huge lake, but in between. A tsunami, 5,500 BC. So there's lots of good evidence to suggest there was a lot more land here before this catastrophe, or this so-called Noah's flood. It's interesting stuff though. Professor Brogger, cited by Murray and Hjort, regarded the Faroes are related to the coast of Norway. A drowned crater lies off Faroe Bank in the southwest of this group, which stands high, possessing rugged perpendicular cliffs and deep narrow fjords like those of Norway and Shetland. They are composed largely of basalt, tufa, and also commoner basalt, with beds of dolerite like several of the inner and outer Hebrides, and like them are completely treeless, although formerly they enjoyed a flourishing and semi-tropical flora, as did the Hebrides. When first occupied by the Norsemen in the 9th century, they bore evidence of former habitation, supposedly by Irish and Scottish monks. It is possible they were inhabited in prehistoric days by priests or hermits associated with the Chaldee or Gnostic faiths. The name Faroe, or more properly Faroe, given to this group lying 180 miles west of Shetland, and possibly part and parcel of it at a period of Homo sapiens, bears a close resemblance to the name of the Faroes. There is also Fair Island, lying halfway between the Shetlands and Orkneys, as to which it may be remembered that, according to the mythological tree of the Uranids, or Titans or Giants, Fairies, Pharaoh was a son of Cretheus, Crete, and grandson of Aeolus. Fairies migrated to Thessaly, which I have shown in detail in my previous work, was originally Argyleshire, founded there as a city of Pharai at a very early time, and started a line of tyrants when tyrants offered the only form of stable government. Villeneuve, in his Phoenician Ireland, contends that the name of Pharaoh was no other than the Erse or Hebridean word for Phara, signifying a chieftain and used by the ancient Irish when they fought their enemies in battle, shouting Fara, Afara, as they charged them. To the Hellenic peoples of the island of Crete, perhaps related to the Praeton or Praetanus, as Rolliston claims in Myths and Legends of the Celtic race, was revered by the Pelasgi and Greeks as the Metris or motherland of the gods and mankind. It was a land where mankind was traditionally first created, just as, according to Plato's Critias, man was first evolved by Poseidon, the earthquake deity, at Mount Atlas. Crete was the theatre of Uranid civilization, and amongst its earlier gods was Poseidon, who in the opinion of some scholars was identical with Uranus, father of the oldest pantheon, and whose habit it was to swallow his own progeny when born. An earthquake-like operation. The Uranid pantheon of deities included Rhea, Cybele, the great goddess, consort of her brother Cronus, Saturn, who mutilated and then succeeded his father Uranus. Gaia, described as the first being that sprang from chaos, namely the earth, became by Uranus, the heavens, or more properly, celestial phenomena, the mother of the Titans or giants who were so detested by their progenitor that they swallowed them up in the first instance. Ge, indignant at his treatment of her progeny, concealed the next lot in the bosom of the earth and then prepared a large iron sickle, wherewith Cronus Saturn mutilated Uranus, whose blood poured into the lakes and rivers, all of which allusions appear to relate to the actions of meteoric impacts, earthquakes, floods in the old red sandstone areas, and the destruction of many of the primeval race of man. At all events, the gods of the Greeks admittedly emanated from Crete, where stood Mount Ida, a mountain of no very great height, but of volcanic origin. That's a bit like the stuff around here. We've got, in Edinburgh, we've got lots of big hills. They're no mountains, but they're big hills, but they're volcanic. They're like old mountains, like been worn and worn and worn. It's like they used to be mountains. The Titans from Tit, the earth, were also known as the Pelasgi, the divine Pelasgi, or of Homer, essentially a maritime people among whose arose the great city, the great deity Hermes, represented by the supreme hierarch of the state, to whom was accorded divine power and who was the teacher of mankind, introduced forms of divine knowledge, including the Kabiri mysteries and magic to other countries, including Tyre, a Samothrace, and Troy or Ilium. As to these hermetic secrets, Herodotus pulls inside the veil slightly when he describes certain peculiar squat statues of the god which were placed in the prows of ships, and remarks of them, "Whoever has been initiated into the mysteries of the Kabiri will understand what I mean." These mysteries, he says, were taught by the Pelasgi to the Samothracians before they ever went to Attica, inferring thereby a very clear date. The squat statues, I judge from other like traces of magic, can only have been a veiled meaning to disguise their precise purpose, namely, a form of early ordinance, as a reference to the Kabiri implies, and ordnance as a reference to the Kabiri implies, and consequently explains how it was the Cretans were able to become the masters of the seas and builders of the first overseas empires, as Thucydides describes. Kabiri science was almost entirely concerned with the uses of fire, grotesque as a small piece of prehistoric ordnance might seem to our eyes, shaped probably in the form of a dragon with an enormous mouth which could belch forth fire and smoke and slay at a distance. Even at no great distance, it must have presented a terrifying aspect to primitive peoples who perhaps scarcely possessed bows and arrows, and would be a powerful incentive to induce them to hand over their treasured possessions. Such statues must have gone far towards enabling Minos, king of Crete, to put down piracy, as we are told was the case, thus opening up the seas to his merchant ships. Plutarch, in his Defectu Oracularum gives a broad hint of Kabiri activities when he tells us that the magic rites attributed to the Idaean Zeus in Crete, to Demeter and Eleusis is the Kabiri and Samothrace, and Dionysus in Delphi and Thebes related to the worship of demons, holy, bad, and intermediate between gods and man. The Cretans were in short the Titans or giants, the men of old, the men of renown, whose thoughts, say the book of Genesis, became wholly evil. We may infer what those demons signified. The flood or great catastrophe occurred far later in the history of the past than is generally believed. It occurred more than 800 years after Abraham went south to the land of Canaan and founded his Kabiri city of Hebron, which bore other names. Thucydides, in his summary of the Hellenic lands before the Deucalion deluge, the self-same flood as Noah's, as I showed at great length in my former volume, and also where it took place, says that they were called after their various tribes, and especially in Pelasgi, a famous maritime people. In Crete's fabulous history we find such names as Cretheus, Crete, Tyro, Tyre, Sidero, Sidon, and Elios, founders of cities and districts in Hellas, including Corinth, Elis, Claydon, Ayatollah, and the Pheres or Pherae, the Magnetes or giants of Thessaly, old Aeolus, and the eponymous hero of patriarch of the Pelasgi or Aeolids, married his niece Tyro, daughter of the haughty Salmoneus, whose presumptions and arrogance were so great that Zeus smote him around his city with a thunderbolt, and Tyro in turn became enamoured of the river Enipeus and was accordingly ill-treated by Sidero, who tortured her because she had many children by the god Poseidon, including the heroes Peleus and Neleus, who disguised himself as the river Enipeus. These clearly bore a prehistoric reference to geography and events, and were a favourite theme of the poets and bards. But whatever the implication, it is certain that they were closely related to the Phoenicians and the Pelasgi. As George Grote, the historian of Greece, says, they merge into one, but Aryan civilization apparently originated in the volcanic Shetland Orkney Isles and in the neighbourhood of Ben More in the island of Mull. There arose the earliest known culture. They were the men of old, the men of renown. Josephus tells us the children of Seth, or Sheth, were the inventors of astronomy and erected certain pillars to warn the world of future events. So this is apparently the children of Shetland, like Sheth comes from Shetland. That's crazy. He says that in the process of time they became perverted, begat sons who made God their enemy, were despisers of all that was good, and were destroyed. He adds that Noah left the land of Seth before the flood. If I claim that the Shetland Orkneys were the original island of Crete, what evidence have I to offer? One clue is contained in Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus, as we know, sailing from Troy after his downfall, hoping to return to his island of Ithaca, came to the coasts of Kykones of Thrace, who dwelt in the neighbourhood of Orcus, the dark black underworld. Orcus related to our Orcades or Orkneys, but also applied to Caithness in the Sutherlandshire. Escaping from their unfriendly attentions, the hero reached the Lotophagi, or lotus eaters, who dwelt, says Herodotus, by the shores of Lake Triton, and implying it to this region were presumably the waters embracing the Shetland Orkney group. From the Lotophagi, maybe that's what it is, Lotophagi. From the Lotophagi, he continued his voyage to the isles inhabited by the gigantic and cannibalistic Cyclops, son of Uranus, who dwelt as hermits in caves, but within near call of one another. Besides their flocks and herds, they were engaged in certain secret avocations, which produced, to cite Homer, superior power, and were near neighbours of the Hyperia, a name referring to a land beyond or above the mainland. These particular Cyclops, who were mainly dwelt on a small island where they were segregated from the rest of mankind, may be assigned to the small islets of the Orkneys, many of which were occupied by hermits in ancient days, and are still termed locally Papai, Pepe, or Papa, signifying priest. If Lake Triton lay in this region, Odysseus was sailing towards Hyperia, the Shetlands. After his dire experience with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the hero, much shaken, escaped to the Eloid island, where he received an almost royal reception and a lavish hospitality from King Aeolus. He gave him the inestimable gift of the four winds in a bag to ensure him peaceful, safe voyage to his native Ithaca. Every rude blast from which its bottom turns the deep, that bag imprisoned held. That's some statement. Every rude blast from which every rude blast which from its bottom turns the deep, that bag imprisoned held. Hence Ulysses turned the ship's prow towards the southwest where the island of Ithaca lay, but the avarice of his crew, who suspected that the bag held other treasure, compelled him to open it. The confined winds escaped, and a resultant violent southwest gale blew him back to Eilid Island. This time his reception was very different, for Aeolus regarded him as one hated by the gods and refused him his crew even shelter. Thereupon, setting out afresh, the same southwest gale carried the luckless hero in the storm-tossed boat to the northeast until at length he reached the inhospitable shores of the Laestrygons. We can distinguish with considerable certainty where they dwelt, for it was a land of the midnight sun, where in summer there is no night, or as Homer so exquisitely describes it, where herds could graze undeterred by nightfall. So that sounds like the north to me, people. Or even maybe the south, the very bottom, but it looks more chance it's going to be the north. The herdsman there, driving his cattle home, summons the shepherd with his flocks abroad. The sleepless there might double wages earn, and tending now the herds, now tending sheep for the night pastures. The Laestrygons were also a giant people, kinsmen of the Cyclops, we are told, addicted like them to cannibalism, who reared herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, and were worshippers of Poseidon like Cyclops and Cretans. Can there be any serious doubt but that Homer, whose geography may be said without hesitation to have been related to the regions of the Atlantic Ocean and in no sense whatever to the Mediterranean, was describing the Norsemen dwelling in the northern parts of Norway, to which Odysseus' ship was blown to the land of the midnight sun? Sir William Ridgway, perhaps the foremost Greek scholar and archaeologist of our period, found no hesitation in pronouncing them the Norwegians. They were also known as the Formiae, a giant people who formed settlements in Libya and were related probably to the Fomoraceae or Fomorai of Irish legend, a cruel but civilized maritime race who tyrannized over that island until they were ultimately defeated by the De Danann. And this De Danann is an Irish tribe, but they were kind of Irish-Scotch. And there's a region in Scotland called De Danann. They were said in the Hibernian legends to have ruled Ireland before the flood, a significant admission. Norse traditions mention an ancient cannibalistic race of giants who lived in Norway in the direction of the present Tromsø, where dwelt, according to the Orphic Argonautica, Cimmerians west of the Raipefe Mountains. If the Laestrygons lived in northern Norway, the inference is that in the view of Homer and Eilid Island there was no other than Shetland, and this is supported by the whole incidents of Odeus' voyage from Orcus in the Orkney region, the Cyclops, and onward to the old Elios Island, and seemingly in the region of Lake Triton. Interesting. So it sounds like all these stories of daughters lost, gods being washed away, things like that, They're really talking about the geography of places. The pelagic Aloids, extremely maritime, form colonies in many parts of Asia, and their connections show them to have been as Uranids, Chaldeo-Phoenicians. Incidentally, probably few lovers of Homer's works have considered seriously the reality of his immortal descriptions as a geographical factor, nor have many asked themselves what serious truth lay behind his fabulous accounts and exaggerated characteristics such as the narcotic habits of the Lotophagi, or the cannibalistic tendencies of the Cyclops, or the nightless day of the Laestrygons. True, he employs pure fantasy, as when he makes Aeolus give Odysseus the 4 winds in a bag, but it was allied to the idea that Boreas concealed the north wind in a cave, and behind it was the suggestion that Aeolus Island, part of Crete, was a region of varying and strong winds. So it was more symbolic, the guy giving the 4 winds to somebody. I think it's representing the islands and the winds that are there. Was a region of varying and strong winds. And all these instances left us remember that Homer was trimming his sails to appeal to the kinds of audience he had to entertain and to instruct. If, as a motive to widen the knowledge of his own age, he used mythology and extravagance to obtain his highlights suited to the mentality of his audience, his system was surely legitimate. It may be asked, what connection there be between the name Aeolus and Shetland? In the north of the mainland lies the island of Yell, and there may be even perhaps recover the reference to the 4 winds. For the island of Yell is separated from the mainland by the Sound of Yell, from which the tides race and the winds blow frequently with hurricane force along that rocky channel with its precipitous cliffs in a region of the world peculiarly subject to unexpected and furious squalls. That this dreaded stretch of sea was known and feared in prehistoric times, and indicated by the unusual number of cairns, ancient burial places of victims to the seas here, together with the remains of rude altars or shrines erected by those who escaped a watery grave in these perilous waters. Here, indeed, it may be said that the unruly winds and seas meet, as they did notably in the 1881, resulting in a grave disaster, and if there has not survived any stack attributed to the old Aeolus, like the old man of Hoy in Orkney, or the legendary old man Boreas, who held the north wind in Fife, in a cave below Mount Hemias in Thrace. Fife. There's a place in Scotland called Fife. Well, it's F-I-F-E. Well, it looks similar. In a cave below Mount Hemias in Thrace, there are in the Yell area many caves in whose depths the winds may be said to capture and hushed. So it sounds like these caves capture the winds from all directions. So they could be talking about, when he says he gave them a bag of 4 winds, this bag could represent an island with the 4 winds with the caves. Examine this name Yell in conjunction with Aeolus, for in pronunciation it is to all intents and purposes the same. Drop the suffix os or us when the Greek root eol or the Latin eol or eol becomes yell, or the slightest variation of it. Then recollect that Aeolus was traditionally king of the Magnes, which the name Pheres, and Aeolid adopted when he founded Magnesia in Thessaly, a strip of coast bordered by the Pagasean Bay and the river Peneus, and situated opposite to Euboea, our island of Mull. The name Magnus or Magnetis became a term to indicate the giant race of Titans, and we find it used somewhere else except in Shetland and Norway, for Shetland's patron saint is Saint Magnus, to whom Saint Magnus Cathedral in Lerwick is dedicated. A somewhat shadowy saint, it is true, but the name suffices, and there is a bay of the same name. Hence both Aeolus and Magnus possess their name places in Shetland. And while on the subject of place names, I would add that it also preserves the unusual name of Ur, of the Chaldeans, and the villains of Ur,
the Ura Firth and the Isle and Strait of Uri near Yell. Ura, Uranus. The last mentioned, being the earliest conception of divinity known to us, was succeeded under mysterious circumstances by his son Cronus Saturn, otherwise Baal, who was taken by Abram to the south country and became the chief deity of the Israelites until a far later date. The suppression of Uranus by Cronus may be related in some manner with the dispute among the Chaldeans of Ur when Abraham revised his conception of the celestial deity according to Josephus in the following passage. He determined to renew and to change the opinion of all men happened then to have concerning God, for he was the first that ventured to publish this notion that there was but one God, the creator of the universe, and that, as to other gods, each of them only afforded it according to his appointment and not by their own power. For which doctrines, when the Chaldeans and other people raised a tumult against him, he thought fit to leave that country and came and lived in the land of Canaan. So they're saying that Abraham came from Scotland. It may be supposed from the foregoing that the Chaldeans had previously worshipped the gods that came newly up, comets and meteors, the Elohim of Genesis or Elohim of the Phoenicians, until Abraham taught that the sun dominated the universe. So arrived the Saturnian age, called the Golden Age, and in view of the ceaseless search for the gold that was true appellation, the age in Minos and Solomon were seeking gold in all parts. It was more scientifically named the Bronze Age, which superseded the earlier Brass Era, the age when Crete, Atlas, Ur, the Phoenicians and Meropes or Pelasgi, and, let me add, Solomon dominated the world, with the living Hermes, the spiritual ruler, above all monarchs. It preceded the flood. The flood, or more justly the great catastrophe, destroyed the cult of Saturn, who became discredited to many, including the Egyptians, depicted to them as a malignant devil in the shape of an immense celestial serpent with 100 voices who spat lightning. He is the old serpent of Revelation who was cast into the bottomless pit of Hades for 1,000 years. But superstition dies hard, and those who imagine this event was cast in the latitude of the Middle East may explain how less than a couple of centuries ago in parts of the Scottish Highlands and in Ireland, where Christianity penetrated slowly into the minds of conservative folk, built-in fires were lighted to Saturn on May Day on every hilltop, and persons walked through the fire of Bel. For this ancient survival, Highland housewives baked special cakes with small lumps or cones raised on their surface, like unleavened bread. Possibly it was a folk memory of the dreadful occasion when volcanic fires burned furiously in those regions, the original Hades or underworld of Britain, a memory believed by many nations, the very region in which traditionally Saturn or Satan was thrown under an island of Britain, according to Plutarch, with rocks and stones hurled upon him, which region I have strongly suggested in my previous volume, related to the strange little island of Staffa. And amazingly enough, Edinburgh is practically volcanic. The whole city lies on basalt, volcanic basalt. Some of the oldest volcanoes, but they're so old that over time they've just been worn to these hills, these volcanic hills. And this is where I was camping. I was camping up these hills. This is where this is where the water comes from. These volcanic hills, just out there, right out the tap. Right out the tap, guys. Those people in America that don't really understand, like, drinking out the tap. Anyway, how much is this to go before part 2? Let's see. Still quite a lot. Right, I'll read another couple of pages and Shit. It was page 31. That the same worship of Saturn or Molech was followed by the Hebrews long before they embraced their monotheistic faith of the God Jehovah is evidenced by many allusions to the burning of victims in the fires to Baal, a practice which actually continued until the overthrow of Jerusalem by the Chaldeans of Babylon. Nor is this similarity surprising when we grasp the truth that the history of the Bible relates to the ancient inhabitants of the North and to the British people in particular. Thus we need find no incongruity in due course if it transpires that not only was the island of Crete the motherland of men, regionally Ur of the Chaldees, or that Ur lay in the Uranid territories, but that the patriarch Abraham or Abram in early days led his followers into the south country from the same Crete or from the adjoining Caledonian lands, and made his way to the southwest of England to Wessex and erected his capital city of Hebron, where now stands Avebury in Wiltshire, and where he and his successors set up the immense serpentine temple to their god Saturn, presided over by Hermes in the Chaldean Rama. Thus may be understood how important it is that the reader should recognise the real situation and prehistoric importance of Crete. Which is crazy, guys. There's been a documentary recently on BBC, and they talk about the Orkney Islands and how the Stone Age, it was the Orkney Islands were actually related to Stonehenge. They reckon that the Orkney Islands was the capital of Britain. New discoveries. This is a brand new. It's on BBC iPlayer if you want to check it out. But they're saying that the Orkney Isles was the capital of Britain at one point, and Stonehenge came secondary. They all came down from there. So it's interesting to think that they say here that Abraham took his people south. So maybe what they're saying is it took them from Scotland down to England, like from Orkney to Stonehenge. And you find these amazing stone structures. Interesting though. Interesting stuff. Right, I'll read this last part and then I'll wrap it up and I'll read this another time. The collapse of the Cretan Empire. The Gnostics of Crete and their later disciples, the Orphics of Samothrace, were part and parcel of the earliest known philosophical and religious hierarchy, presided over the deity Hermes, who later removed the seat of divinity from Knossos to Samothrace. The great Ram, or Rama, the venerable being, his sway embraced the Chaldeans, or usually Chaldees of Britain, who were in fact the Orphics, which ancient sects survived until well into the Christian era and extended into England as far south as at least York. These could be the Picts. Their sway embraced all Scotland, northern England, and the considerable part of Norway, as far north at least as Tromsø. This important aspect of the past deserves our passing attention. In continuity, no religious cult can approach the Chaldeans, who claimed descent from Seth, the original Hermes, and as early as the time of Abram were the moral and spiritual and political guides of the civilized world. It is true they changed their alliance more than once, and the persecutions they suffered under the Romans as Druids remained almost a closed book, but they survived until a late day. As early as ecclesiastical history can be traced, the ancient city of York had become the head of Chaldee, or Colidai, or Caelidai Church. Canon Rain states that its archbishops exercised jurisdiction over all of Scotland, including Iona and the Orkney Islands, and that they performed acts of visitation and consecration through the North Britain. They survived in York and Ripon as late as 1195. Until that date, they also claimed ecclesiastical supremacy in Norway as far north as Tromsø, says the same authority. It is a strange coincidence that this territorial supremacy should have included the regions which might have said to have been dominated or ruled by the Chaldeans or Chaldees from the earliest times. It is not when the facts are appreciated. The curates of Crete, who gave us the word curate to signify a priest and who were the teachers of the people, composed epic stories of gods and heroes. Another branch were the Corybantes, the bards and singers of choruses and hymns, and this sect or caste include the Galai, the special priests of the Cretan mother goddess Rhea Cybele, also called Galatia, after whom they named Galatia, or Gauls, otherwise later as the Cimmerians or Hyperboreans. The Romans had a tradition that the Cyclop Polyphemus had 3 sons by Galatia named Celtus, Illyrius, and Gallus. The Cretan cult of the Great Mother, Rhea Cybele, and later that of Dionysus, assumed wild orgies, especially in Phrygia, originally colonized by Crete, Lydia, and adjoining lands in connection with certain sacred rites performed amid violent ecstasies, doubtless assisted by strong liquor in the Dionysiac orgies. Their Corybantes, with drums, cymbals, horns, and an armour, enthusiastically performed their orgastic dances in the forest and mountains. The Galai, inspired by fanaticism or example, since they comprised the singing priests, were said to perform a voluntary act of castration in honour of the goddess. But it may have not been entirely unrelated to the timbre of their voices. Crete's acme of power was reached in the reign of Minos, as was that of Kingdom of Israel under Solomon, both monarchs having many remarkable resemblances. So, Minos, designated son of Oceanus by the poets, was an Iliad according to the historian Ephorus, but his origin remains obscure, concealed in myth. Like Solomon, he became king in his very early youth, was a lawgiver, a cruel tyrant, sent to ships on long voyages, was avid for wealth, and introduced strange goddesses into his country for political reasons. Thucydides describes how he established a navy, made himself master of the Hellenic seas, and to ensure trade without piracy expelled the Syrians or Carani from the Cyclades Isles. Cyclades Isles. The Carians are an important clue in this investigation. The Hellenic Sea upon which they dwelt was also sometimes termed the Deculian Sea, because where they felt the dire effects of the Deculian deluge, we find the old Scots geographer Lindsay of Pitscotty calling the Hebridean Sea with its isles the Oceanus Deculadian, which may present a survival of folklore in respect of those historic waters. The Carians or Syrians, placed in Asia Minor by accepted methods of geography, are described by Herodotus as subject of Minos at an early date. So I think what they're saying here is that this Minos character is really Solomon, or they have really close coincidence, like there's things that relate them. Right. Dwelling among the isles, says he, and never so far as I have been able to push my inquiries liable to give tribute to any man. He praises them further in these words: they served on board the ships of King Minos whenever he required, and thus, as he was a great conqueror and prospered in his wars, the Careni in his day were the most famed by far of all nations on the earth. For excellent reason, we should take note of this maritime people. They can be traced back to Scotland. Ptolemy in his Geographa places the Careni, or Kairones as dwelling in the northwest of Scotland. The sea-living Kairenai or Kairones are placed by him as in the neighbourhood of Acharn, the Cape Wrath, Acharn and Carrion, and the vicinity of Loch Carron, opposite Skye. The Carron being the Acheron of the underworld, as shown in my previous volume. Adjacent to the many Hebridean Isles, Sir William Ridgway claims that the Carians and the Leleges were the same, and it may be recalled that the steersman or skipper of the Argo was Ancaeus, chief of the Leleges. Page 34. I'll read this last page since it's rounded off. Carians or Legles, racially they were related to the Philistines. Herodotus describes how they mutilated their faces with knives in honour of Osiris, also a Philistine religious custom. And we find in the scriptures how King David and his successors employed Philistines or Carians or Cretans as their bodyguard. It is generally recognised by the Bible authorities that the Legles were the same as the Philistines, the remnant of Caphtor, usually interpreted as signifying Crete. If in place of the letter L we employ P, a legitimate exchange seen how the latter, Goidel, invaders of Britain, it has been contended apparently introduced or forced the P sounds for many words, especially those beginning with B, K or L. The name Leleges becomes Peleges, a variation of Felishtim or Pelishim. We discover the same Peleg in OT a little mysteriously. Unto Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. The earth divided suggests the great catastrophe, and inferentially that Peleg suffered worse than others, nor is that surprising if his habitat were as indicated, for according to my interpretation of Homer, the Hellenic Hades lay in these very parts. The Carron River is stated having been the Acheron, river of hell, which would explain the conundrum of the Philistines as being the remnant of Caphtor, for they were ostensibly a part of the Cretan Empire, and those of them in the south became but a remnant after the flood disaster. We have in fact another clue in the river Pyrepiglion, Flamen Phlegethon, commemorated by Homer in the heart of Hades. It may further be identified with Phlegra, another legendary site of the battle between gods and giants. The position of the Kairenai in this Hades region is denoted by Ptolemy, helps consider to establish the true situation of Shetland as the original Crete. So what they're saying here is that all the ancient stories have been taken from these so-called Atlanteans or Kairenai, or these people that lived in the north, and it looks like they adopted them. This is what he's saying, I think. The Isles of the Carians blocked the passage of King Minos' ships on their voyages to distant shores, and he had to subject them, which he did with much wisdom by making them the nucleus of his own mariners or ship's crews. The passage in Genesis which describes Peleg as a son of Eber may be further corroborated in the fact that all the islands of western Scotland are named the Hebrides, otherwise Isles of Eber or the Hebrews, a name which has resisted all changes from a prehistoric past. So there we go, we've got the Hebrides, the Isles of Eber, Hebrews. That's pretty crazy. But to return to Crete herself, Homer gives the other clues to its situation beside that of Elias. In one passage he describes the Crete in her zenith. There is a land amid the sable flood called Crete, fair, fruitful, circled by the sea. Numerous are her inhabitants, a race not to be summoned, and 90 towns she boasts. One city in extent the rest exceeds. Knossos, the city which Minos reigned, who ever at 9 years close conferred with Jove himself. In another passage, Odysseus, disguised himself as a stranger to his wife Penelope, describes how, when on his way to Troy, her husband was given by stress of weather to seek shelter at Knossos, where he called on King Idomeneus, one of the heroes who fought on the side of Agamemnon against Troy, to whose action was attributed Crete's later disasters. Here is a passage in prose. There I saw Odysseus, for the might of the winds bare him to Crete, as he was making for the land of Troy, and had driven him wandering beyond Melia. So he stayed his ships in Amnisus, whereby is the cave of Ilithia, in heaven's heart to gain, and scarce he escaped the tempest. Anon he reached the city and asked for Idomeneus. Cowper's rendering of the dangerous interest to Knossos, and perhaps preferable, the storm his barks bore into Amnisus, for the cave of Ilithia, a dangerous port which, with difficulty, he attained. I suggest that this city may conjecturally be recognised in Shetland, very near to the present city of Lerwick, where the Sound, though affording a fine anchorage, has a difficult entrance for sailing ships. Odysseus, we are told, anchored in Amnisus of Knossos, Amnisus being mentioned only by Priscian in relation to the Pole Islands, also called the Boreades, hence the northernmost isles. Priscian also gives the names of Nisides, or the Ivy Islands, Ivy being sacred to the god Dionysus. These isles, he says, were inhabited by the Ammonites, whose women performed Bacchic or Dionysic rites and were crowned with ivy berry and leaves. Oh. Right, I think I'm going to call it a night of that. It's interesting stuff. Definitely got to read the rest. But where did I get to? Page 35. So we can see where we're going here, guys. This guy is saying that the Greeks and the Romans, they plagiarised a lot of culture. And a lot of these characters could be islands. Could be talking a bit more about geography. But I'll write that down, page 35. And I'll continue this on another date, guys. Cheers for coming in, and I'll have a wee look at chat. That's been 2 hours. 2 hours reading. And all those Greek words, man. All those Greek names. It's so hard. So hard to pronounce these properly. But I'm not a Greek. Gareth Milton. Oh, sorry I missed this, man. Sounds real interesting. I was born in Hamilton but stayed in Shetland for about 15 years. Moved to Aberdeen and settled in Dunfermline now. Gareth, you would have liked to hear this stuff, because there's a lot of Shetland in here. Who's this? Cad et Oliver. Olivia. Validation boy. Exactly, delete. That's another thing. Why has Britain and America got such a hold on this place called Israel? You know what I mean? Why, like, what other nations are like that? Imagine if the Islamic countries thought they populated a place in Britain and they continually tried to keep, like, the Crusades, like, from the past, the Middle Eastern wars. Like, why do we have this continuing attack in the Middle East? It's crazy. Anyway, guys, I'm going to wrap this one up. 2 hours.
Thanks for coming along. And I'll probably have a hangout or something like that about the flat earth rocket and all that garbage, like in between this, but I'll definitely do this again. It was fun. Cheers for coming out, guys. I'll see you later.